Next, let's look at architecture development iteration. This iteration typically spans across phases B, C, and D, but it may also subsume the transition planning iteration within it, and hence often incorporates phases E and F as well. This iteration primarily focuses on developing the architecture through phases B, C, and D across four architecture domains of business, data, applications, and technology, often referred to as the BDAT architecture domains. Although different domains of architecture are worked on in each architecture phase, there are a lot of commonalities in the approaches taken in the phases B to D, as all of them incorporate the following four steps. Number one, comprehending the current state architecture of the domain. The second step being articulating a refined and validated target state architecture of the domain. And the third step is understanding the gap that exists between the current and target state architectures. And the fourth step is to create a pragmatic high-level roadmap to go from current state to a target state architecture. Now let's look at each of the phases individually. Phase B focuses on business architecture. Architecture initiatives are always focused on business outcomes, and hence this phase is a prerequisite for other phases of architecture development, that is phases C and D. The objective of phase B is to take inputs from business strategy, architecture vision, stakeholder concerns, and aspirations to formulate a target state business architecture and to articulate an approach to achieving this target state purely from a business standpoint. This phase needs to demonstrate how the proposed architecture enhancements and changes will achieve strategic and tactical business objectives and address stakeholder concerns. Phase C focuses on data and applications architecture, and it is referred to as the information systems architecture phase. In this phase, the architects take the inputs from the architecture vision and business architecture to arrive at architectural changes required in the enterprise's applications and information landscape. Different philosophies and approaches exist, advocating a data-driven or applications-driven approach to organizing work in this phase. Effectively, the key challenge addressed by this phase are around applications integration and access, management, and governance of data across a portfolio of systems in context. Phase D focuses on technology architecture, essentially covering the foundational hardware and software infrastructure supporting the enterprise solutions. The approach in this phase involves a capability and capacity assessment of the infrastructure in the current state and articulating the ideal target state infrastructure capabilities to support the target state information systems architecture articulated in phase C. Next, we will look at the transition planning iteration. While in some contexts, the transition planning iteration is treated as part of the architecture development, in many cases, it makes a lot of sense to organize a separate iteration involving only the phases E and F, enabling the architecture effort to focus on tactical and strategic opportunities and realizing architectures through enterprise initiatives. This enables effective handoff of architecture to implementation teams. Now let's look at each of the phases in the transition planning iteration. Phase E is referred to as the opportunities and solutions phase, and this is the first of the two phases through which architecture is moved from an abstract and conceptual level towards implementation. In this phase, architects collaborate closely with stakeholders, which includes but is not limited to the sponsors, the target consumers, the impacted teams, the implementers, operations, and change management. Working together with stakeholders, the objective of this phase is to arrive at a viable strategic roadmap for realizing the architecture. The gaps identified across all architecture domains and the initial high-level roadmaps arrived at in phases B to D are taken as inputs and validated against the stakeholder priorities, concerns, constraints, and any other feedback before they are further fleshed out in greater detail to create a viable high-level roadmap and also broken down into high-level candidate work packages as a first step to transition the architecture to implementation. Phase F or the migration planning phase essentially involves using the endorsed architecture roadmap and the candidate work packages to work with the portfolio and program managers to identify how the architecture roadmap can be realized through enterprise initiatives, which could be any of the existing initiatives that are already funded and underway, or it could be future initiatives planned for implementation, and it might perhaps involve new initiatives that may need to be identified, prioritized, and approved for implementation. Organizations typically use enterprise portfolio, program, project, and change management frameworks to implement various enterprise initiatives and also to take it to the end consumers subsequently in the form of usable solutions. Hence, at the end of phase F, while the enterprise architects will continue to stay engaged with the implementation teams, the realization of the architecture itself is left to be managed via an implementation program of works which typically operate within another framework such as a program or portfolio management framework. Hence the name migration planning. Next, we will look at the architecture governance iteration, which incorporates phases G and H. Both phases G and H run in parallel with the implementation itself. Phase G is called the architecture governance phase, and this phase is all about architects staying engaged to ensure that the implementation is in conformance with the proposed vision for target state architecture and to ensure the delivery of the business benefits from the implementation of the architecture. But all things cannot be foreseen, and the implementation projects are very often a domain of emergence that are influenced by many factors. Hence, architects will need to stay engaged to evaluate deviations required from the proposed architecture and apply trade-offs and choices to support quick and pragmatic architecture decisions required by the implementation teams. This is essentially the focus of phase H, referred to as the architecture change management phase. That brings us to the end of this module, which offered a quick overview of the TOGAF process framework, referred to as the architecture development method, and we looked at how it is meant to be operationalized within an enterprise. We also looked at the various standardized iterations mentioned in TOGAF, and as part of that discussion, we also covered briefly each of the phases of TOGAF and what they accomplish as part of the architecture development process. In the next few modules, we will explore these phases even further and also offer some practical insights into the application of these phases in real-world enterprises.